Edit a generative model. In this video, we'll edit a form and we'll update a distributed design. In Fusion 360, we want to carry on with our generative frame outcome 1, and we also want to make sure that we still have our generative design geometry setup open. At this point, we're going to begin exploring how to modify the generative outcome. The first thing that we want to do is we want to take the combined feature at the end of the timeline, right-click, and we're going to suppress it. By suppressing the feature, we have kept all the obstacle bodies in the design, so we can use them if we wish individually, but what we've done is we've removed any chance for them to cut through our frame geometry and create those hard edges. The next thing that we want to talk about is ways in which we can actually modify this design. As I mentioned previously, creating generative design outcomes can often be used as the basis or inspiration for a final design, or they can be used as the final design themselves. There are a lot of aspects that come to modifying a form design, so you should be comfortable with form tools. We're going to explore some of the different ways in which we can modify the design, but we aren't going to be diving too deep into the form toolset in this video. First, let's right-click on the organic feature and select Edit. From here, we want to note the differences between the display. Remember that this form's design is a surface, and the feature Boundary Fill 1 is used to combine that surface with the solid preserved geometry. So one of the important aspects that we first need to identify is these blue regions, which are frozen in the design. This means that we are not able to move them with the Edit Form tool. Being frozen means that they are fixed in place and we cannot change their location. We can go to Modify, Freeze, and we can unfreeze them, but we also run the risk of having problems downstream creating our solid body. So for this example, we're not going to make any adjustments or modifications to any of the geometry that's touching these solid preserved geometries. It's important to note as well that we have the ability to unfreeze and completely delete geometry as long as we either patch up the holes or we reconnect them to other solid bodies. So that is important because in this frame design, it would really be beneficial for us to carry this top frame brace all the way up to the upper portion of our stem. However, because that is a more complicated process, let's look at some easier things that we can do. When we look at this frame, there are a couple sections where we have these bumps or indentions, and likely those are not really needed to be structural. They probably just happened as a result of the resolution during the solve. So we want to try to smooth those out. This can be done manually by going into Edit Form and simply selecting a face, an edge, or some of the vertices, but that oftentimes is going to create more problems than it's going to help because we're going to need to pull this out and then we need to fix some of the surrounding geometry. So I'm going to cancel that and I'm going to take a look at some of the other tools that we have. Inside the Modify dropdown, there are many different tools that can be used to help repair or work on these form bodies. Things like Erase and Fill are great if you have T-spline geometry that has some of these connected areas, these stems, and you want to simply remove them and patch. So that can be used very easily to clean up some of this geometry. We can also use other tools such as Cylindrify. So Cylindrify can be extremely helpful if we're trying to take some of these areas of the frame and make them a little bit more like a cylinder. What we want to do is we want to explore that, but we also want to take a look at things like smooth and pull and flatten and even straighten. Let's start by taking a look at smooth. First, I need to select the faces that I want to smooth. The process is extremely important because the more faces that we select, it's going to allow it to make an average over the selected region. So you want to make sure that you do select a couple of the faces that don't need to be smooth, and then you grab all the ones that do need to be smooth as well. In this case, I'm going to wrap around this corner, and once I have all those selected, I'm going to go one more in this direction, and then I'm going to take the smoothing slider and I'm going to begin dragging it to the right. First, stopping in the middle, and then let's go all the way to the right and take a look at the results. That looks pretty good. I'm happy with those results, but we can add a couple more faces and allow it to recalculate. Sometimes if we grab a few more faces, it can really help those results smoothen out. But in this case, it really didn't add much to the process. So from here, I'm going to select OK because I'm happy with those results, but there's still a little bit more that we can do. You can see that this might have potentially caused a slight crease or ridge, but really what we're seeing is the ghosted image of the original body underneath, and we can see where it's moved to. Next, let's take a look at using the straighten option. When we select straighten, what we need to do is first pick a direction. We can either fit, which will take the selected vertices and it'll average them. We can use a selected line, a selected paraline, or we can select 2 points. Let's start with the fit and just see how it works. First, I'm going to begin grabbing vertices along this edge. And you'll notice that each time I make a new selection, it begins to average them out. So as we move further and further down the design, and if we pick one up here as well, you can see that it's beginning to pull them out and average or fit them over the entire selection. That looks pretty good, and I'm going to select one more around this edge to see if I can pull it out just a little bit more. You can see that last one probably made the biggest difference. It's also important to note that these don't have to be in a straight line. I can select vertices that are above or below, but keep in mind that we are averaging based on our selection. So you do want to make sure that you are consistent with the selection process and you don't randomly pick these vertices. You'll notice what's happening as I'm selecting these is it's pulling them closer and closer together. While this might be a good solution in some cases, this is likely going to be problematic for our geometry if we are creating a crease or a ridge. So we're straightening those out and that looks pretty good. So I'm going to select OK. And just keep in mind that there are other options that we can use for that geometry. Next, let's take a look at another tool. We've already used smooth and we've already used straighten. We also have flatten if we need to pull a section closer to a plane or parallel to a plane. But the next one that I want to focus on is I want to take a look at using pull. Now, in our case, pull is not going to be the best tool, but it is a great tool if you have an underlying mesh or surface body that you want to pull the points to. So I think it's an extremely important tool, especially if you have some reference geometry. But the last tool that we really want to focus on, let's go ahead and take a look at Cylindrify, as a lot of times when you're creating generative design results, you're really looking at these pipe and these stem type geometries. So I'm going to rotate this around and I'm going to begin selecting these faces with a box selection. And notice how it creates a cylindrical version of that. If you want to add more to that, you can always drag and add to your selection. But keep in mind that using the Shift key is probably the best option to add these. And based on how your selection preferences are set up, you might be only including faces that are completely encompassed in your selection. So you might want to end up rotating this around unless you're using a polygon selection or the painted selection. So now that I have all those faces selected, that is a pretty good result. I'm going to say OK, and I'm not going to worry about the warning. It's telling me that it has to unfreeze some of the affected regions. I'm going to allow it to unfreeze, which will pull this edge just slightly. And we need to double check to make sure that that edge still does overlap that solid body. We can find this out real quick if we finish the form and we still have a solid frame. If we don't have a solid frame anymore, then those edges need to be fixed. But by looking in the bodies folder, we can see that body 23 is the frame itself, and it does include all of that other geometry. If we look at this from the top, we can see the area that we worked on has this crease and this sort of pinched section in it. So while we did our best to try to smooth that region out, we likely introduced some additional curvature that just isn't needed. So there is a point where you can go too far. Now, unfortunately, the Forms tools do not capture history. So in order to really fix that, we have to use undo and go back in and undo before the point where we really added that secondary line, or we can continue to use the form tools to smooth out and adjust those. From here, I'm just going to finish the form and go back to basically the original frame shape, but it's important that we understand the tools that we have at our disposal to begin making those modifications. At this point, I do want to save the frame, and then I want to go back into my generative design geometry setup, as this is now going to be out of date. Because we did make a change to the frame and they are still linked, you can see that the component is out of date. We're simply going to select the triangle icon, and this is going to update it to the most current version. Because we didn't make any drastic changes with the exception of no longer cutting those obstacles away, not much change in terms of the position or the overall shape, but it is important that we do capture those updates. At this point, let's make sure that we save this assembly as well before moving on.